"Happy 25th anniversary," David said behind me, his voice carrying that familiar tone of practiced warmth that had replaced genuine affection somewhere around year 12. "Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you." I turned, expecting flowers, maybe breakfast in bed, perhaps even one of those romantic gestures he used to surprise me with when we were young and still believed in forever. Instead, David stood in his perfectly pressed navy suit, briefcase in one hand and a manila envelope in the other. His silver-streaked hair was immaculately styled, his tie knotted with the precision of a man who controlled every aspect of his appearance and everything else in his world. The envelope extended toward me like an offering, but something in his expression made my chest tighten. This wasn't the face of a man presenting anniversary plans. "What's this?" I asked, wiping my hands on the dish towel, though they weren't wet, a nervous habit I'd never quite shaken. "Your freedom," he said simply. "Our freedom." I stared at the manila envelope, my mind struggling to process his words. Freedom. On our anniversary. The white roses suddenly seemed garish against the morning light, their perfection artificial and mocking. "I don't understand," I whispered, though part of me already did. The late nights at the office that had stretched into years. The way he looked through me at dinner parties. The separate bedrooms we'd maintained for the past 18 months under the guise of his sleep apnea. The careful distance he maintained whenever we were photographed together for the society pages. David set his briefcase down and straightened his shoulders, his courtroom posture. After 25 years of marriage to Washington, D.C.'s most prominent corporate lawyer, I recognized all his professional tells. "Victoria, we both know this marriage has run its course," he said, using the measured tone he reserved for difficult clients. "We've grown apart. We want different things. It happens to couples who marry young. We had married young. I was 23, fresh out of Georgetown University with a degree in art history and dreams of working for the Smithsonian. David was 26, a junior associate at Morrison Klein & Associates with ambitions that burned as bright as his charm. We met at a gallery opening in DuPont Circle, where I was working part-time while applying for curator positions. "You have incredible insight," he had said, finding me studying a Jackson Pollock reproduction that everyone else dismissed as derivative. "Most people see chaos. You see the intentional structure underneath." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, like this video, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Now, 25 years later, he was asking me to see the intentional structure underneath the collapse of our marriage. "Different things," I repeated, finally taking the envelope. It felt heavier than paper should. Such as the fact that you've spent the last decade turning into someone I barely recognize," he said, and there was the first hint of genuine emotion in his voice, irritation. "The constant charity work, the art collecting, the way you've inserted yourself into every cultural institution in the city. It's exhausting, Victoria." My fingers tightened on the envelope. Those activities he found exhausting had filled the void left by his increasing absence from our marriage. When he stopped coming home for dinner, I joined the Kennedy Center board. When he began traveling every other weekend for depositions, I started the Georgetown Art Society. When our conversations dwindled to logistics about household management and social obligations, I poured my energy into causes that mattered to me. "I've been building a life," I said quietly, "since you stopped participating in ours." "That's exactly what I mean," David said, checking his Rolex, a habit that indicated he wanted to end uncomfortable conversations. The accusations, the passive-aggressive comments. "We used to be happy, Victoria. We used to laugh together." He was right. We had laughed together. In the early years, we'd stayed up until 3 in the morning debating everything from Supreme Court decisions to whether Warhol was a Genius or a fraud, David would bring home takeout from our favorite Indian restaurant, and we'd eat sitting on the floor of our tiny Adams Morgan apartment, planning our future with the confidence of people who believed love conquered everything. "When did you decide?" I asked, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. "It wasn't one moment," he said, softening slightly. "It was gradual. But I suppose the final realization came 6 months ago, at the Morrison holiday party. I watched you networking, commanding every conversation, and I realized I felt like a stranger observing someone else's wife. 6 months ago, the holiday party where I had worn the emerald green Vera Wang dress he'd complimented, where I'd made him laugh during cocktails by perfectly impersonating Judge Harrison's pompous closing arguments. The night I'd thought we'd reconnected, when he'd whispered in my ear during dinner that I was the most captivating woman in the room. "You seemed happy that night," I said. "I was proud of you," he admitted. "But pride isn't the same as partnership. We've become business associates managing a household and a social calendar. When was the last time we talked about something that mattered to both of us?" I opened my mouth to answer and realized I couldn't. Not because the moment didn't exist, but because I couldn't remember it clearly enough to defend it. "The papers are fair," David continued, his lawyer voice returning. "More than fair, actually. The house is yours, obviously. Your trust fund remains yours. I'm not seeking spousal support, and the division of assets favors you significantly. My trust fund," of course he would mention that. My grandfather's textile fortune, inherited when I turned 30, had always been a delicate subject between us. David's pride had been wounded when my inheritance dwarfed his salary, even as his career flourished. We'd agreed early in our marriage that my money would remain separate, used primarily for investments and charitable giving. It was one of the few financial decisions where David had deferred to me completely. "How generous of you," I said, unable to keep the sarcasm from my voice. "Not seeking spousal support from your wife's trust fund." His jaw tightened. "Victoria, let's not make this ugly. We're both intelligent adults. We can handle this with dignity." Dignity. The word hung between us like a challenge. I thought of all the times I'd maintained dignity while he worked late with his attractive young associates. All the dinner parties, where I'd smiled graciously while he charmed other women, his hand on my back more possessive than affectionate. All the times I'd bitten back questions about his increasingly frequent business trips to cities that seemed to require very long weekends. "Does she know?" I asked quietly. David's face went carefully blank. "Does who know what?" "Your associate, the one with the red hair who laughs at all your jokes. Does she know you're filing for divorce today? Or is she waiting for you to tell her the good news?" "There's no one else, Victoria. This is about us." But his denial came too quickly, too practiced. I'd seen him lie to opposing counsel enough times to recognize his tells. The slight tightening around his eyes, the way his fingers drummed once against his leg before he caught himself. "Of course not," I said. "This is just about us growing apart. About me becoming someone exhausting. About you feeling like a stranger." "Yes?" I nodded and walked to the kitchen window, looking out at the garden I'd spent years cultivating. The late October morning was crisp and clear, the kind of day that had once made me feel grateful for the life we'd built together. Now it felt like a stage set for a play I hadn't auditioned for. "I need to ask you something, David, and I need you to be honest with me for once." "Victoria, how long have you been planning this?" He was quiet for so long I thought he might not answer. When I turned back to face him, he was staring at his hands. 2 years, he said finally. Maybe longer. It started as just thoughts. Wondering what life might be like if we were different people, if we'd made different choices. 2 years. While I'd been organizing charity auctions and hosting dinner parties and trying to bridge the growing silence between us, he'd been planning his escape. While I'd been wondering why he seemed distracted during our weekend conversations, he'd Been imagining a life without me in it. The timing is interesting, I observed. Right after my grandfather's textile mills finally sold. Right after the trust fund grew by another $40 million. That has nothing to do with this. Doesn't it? You waited until my inheritance was secure, until your financial future was guaranteed regardless of how the assets are divided. Very strategic, counselor. David's face flushed. You're being paranoid. And honestly, this is exactly the kind of cynicism that's made our marriage impossible. You see calculation in everything. I see calculation because there usually is calculation. It's what made you a successful lawyer. It's also what's made you a calculating husband. He picked up his briefcase and I knew the conversation was over. David had mastered the art of ending discussions before they could truly begin, a skill that served him well in court, but had slowly suffocated our marriage. I'll be staying at the Willard until we can work out the logistics, he said. My secretary has the contact information if you need anything. How thoughtful. You've planned everything. Victoria. I know you're angry, but in time, you'll see this is best for both of us. We can both have the lives we actually want instead of pretending to want the life we have. After he left, I sat at the kitchen table holding the manila envelope, afraid to open it. The white roses were already beginning to droop, their petals scattering across the marble countertop like confetti after a funeral. I thought about calling my sister Margaret in San Francisco, or my best friend Caroline who lived just 6 blocks away. I thought about calling my lawyer or my mother, or anyone who might help me make sense of what had just happened. Instead, I walked upstairs to David's study. Our study, I corrected myself, though I'd rarely used it during our marriage. The room smelled like his cologne and leather-bound law books. His desk was clear, except for his Mont Blanc pen set and a framed photograph of us at last year's Kennedy Center honors. We looked happy in the photo, or at least content. I was wearing the sapphire necklace he'd given me for our 20th anniversary, my hand resting on his arm as we smiled for the society photographer. I sat in his chair and opened the manila envelope. The divorce papers were exactly as he'd described, generous to the point of seeming calculated. The house, the cars, 70% of our joint assets, and no claim on my trust fund. David was keeping his law practice, his pension, and his freedom. It was the kind of settlement that would make people say how amicable our divorce was, how civilized we were being about ending our marriage. But tucked behind the financial documents was something David hadn't mentioned, a detailed list of assets he was claiming. And there, on page 12, was an entry that made me laugh out loud in the empty room. 50% interest in Meridian Properties LLC, estimated value $2.3 million. Meridian Properties. The commercial real estate venture David had started 18 months ago with his law school roommate, Marcus Chen. The small investment opportunity he'd mentioned casually over dinner one night, asking if I minded if he used some of our joint savings to get involved. It's just a little side project, he'd said. Marcus found some undervalued commercial properties in Baltimore. Might be worth a modest profit in a few years. I'd signed the papers he'd brought home without reading them carefully. After 25 years of marriage, I'd trusted him to handle our investments wisely. The $50,000 he'd mentioned seemed insignificant compared to our overall portfolio. Now he was claiming that his $50,000 investment had grown to over $2 million in 18 months. During a commercial real estate downturn, I walked to the filing cabinet where David kept our financial records and pulled out the folder labeled Meridian Properties. The documents told a story that would have been fascinating, if it weren't so personally devastating. David's initial investment hadn't been $50,000. It had been $500,000, most of it borrowed against our home's equity without my knowledge. The Baltimore properties weren't undervalued. Buildings purchased for renovation. They were prime development lots that had been purchased with inside information about upcoming zoning changes and a planned metro extension. Marcus Chen's signature appeared on dozens of documents, but so did another name I didn't recognize. Rebecca Martinez, Esquire. A quick search on my laptop revealed Rebecca Martinez was a 34-year-old lawyer specializing in municipal development law. Her firm's website featured a professional headshot of an attractive woman with red hair and an engaging smile. The same red hair I'd noticed at the Morrison holiday party 6 months ago. I spent the next 2 hours reading through every document in the Meridian Properties file, cross-referencing dates and amounts with our bank statements and credit card bills. The pattern that emerged was meticulous in its deception. David had used our joint accounts to make initial payments, then shifted to a separate business account once the property began generating income. He'd hidden loan documents behind routine financial papers he'd asked me to sign. He'd scheduled property inspections during my charity work hours and business dinners during my book club meetings. For 18 months, while I'd been wondering why he seemed distracted and distant, David had been building a secret fortune with his law school friend and his beautiful associate. They'd turned a carefully orchestrated real estate scheme into a multi-million-dollar enterprise, using our marriage as collateral and my trust as camouflage. The final document in the file was a partnership agreement dated just 2 weeks ago, transferring David's shares in Meridian Properties to a new entity, Martinez and Thornfield Development. Rebecca Martinez and David Thornfield, equal partners in business, and, I was now certain, much more. I laughed again, but this time it was the laugh of someone who'd finally understood the punchline to a very long joke. David thought he was walking, away from our marriage with half of a small real estate investment and his freedom to start over with Rebecca Martinez. What he didn't know was that I'd been building my own secret for the past 5 years. And unlike his carefully hidden assets, mine were completely legal. I walked to my bedroom and opened the jewelry box that had belonged to my grandmother. Inside, beneath the velvet lining, was a key to a safety deposit box David knew nothing about. 5 years ago, when I'd first noticed the growing distance between us, I'd begun making my own investments. Small purchases at first, using money from my separate trust account. Art pieces, rare books, vintage jewelry, items I claimed were for our home or my charitable auction work. But I hadn't been collecting for our home. I'd been collecting for my future. The safety deposit box contained documentation for assets David would never think to look for because he'd never bothered to understand what truly interested me. While he'd been building his real estate empire, I'd been quietly assembling one of the most valuable private art collections on the East Coast. The Monet water lily painting I'd bought at auction for the living room was actually one of a series of 12, and I owned 3 of them. The reproduction Picasso sketches in my study were original preparatory drawings worth more than David's annual salary. The vintage jewelry I wore to charity events wasn't just beautiful, it was historically significant and increasingly valuable. Over 5 years, while maintaining the facade of a dutiful society wife, I'd invested nearly $8 million of my trust fund money in assets that were now worth over $20 million. And because I'd been careful to keep all purchases in my name alone, funded entirely by my separate inheritance, David had no legal claim to any of it. I sat on my bed, holding the key to my safety deposit box, and smiled for the first time since. David had handed me those divorce papers. He thought he was the only one who'd been planning for life after our marriage. He thought his secret real estate venture and his secret girlfriend gave him all the advantages in our divorce. He was wrong. I picked up my phone and dialed my lawyer, not the family attorney David and I had used for estate planning, but the private lawyer I'd retained 6 months ago when I'd first begun to suspect David was hiding something. Patricia Winters was known for her discretion and her ruthless effectiveness in high-asset divorce cases. Patricia? It's Victoria Thornfield. David filed this morning. Yes, exactly as we discussed. I think it's time we presented our counteroffer. I spoke to Patricia. I walked back downstairs to the kitchen. The white roses had dropped more petals, leaving a trail across the marble like breadcrumbs in a fairy tale. But this wasn't a story about getting lost in the woods. This was a story about finding out exactly where I stood and deciding where I wanted to go next. David thought he was giving me divorce papers on our anniversary. Instead, he'd given me something much more valuable: the perfect opportunity to show him that he wasn't the only one who knew how to plan ahead. Patricia Winters arrived at my Georgetown home 3 hours later, carrying a leather briefcase that matched her no-nonsense demeanor. At 52, she had silver hair cut in a sharp bob and wore the kind of understated designer suit that whispered rather than shouted about success. Her reputation for dismantling carefully constructed lies made her the most sought-after divorce attorney in Washington's social circles. "Show me everything," she said, settling into my living room with the efficiency of someone who'd conducted hundreds of similar conversations. I spread the Meridian Properties documents across my coffee table, watching Patricia's expression remain neutral as she absorbed the scope of David's deception. She made notes on a yellow legal pad, occasionally asking for clarification about dates or amounts. "Your husband is either extremely arrogant or extremely stupid," she said finally. "Possibly both. Using marital assets to fund a business venture without disclosure is bad enough. Hiding the profits is worse. But documenting everything so meticulously?" She tapped her pen against the partnership agreement. "It's like he wanted to get caught." "He never thought I'd look," I said. In 25 years, I never questioned his financial decisions. I trusted him completely. Expensive mistake on his part. Patricia pulled out her phone. "I'm calling my investigator. If David has been this careless with business records, I want to know what else we might find." While Patricia made arrangements, I walked to the kitchen to make tea, needing something to do with my hands. The morning felt surreal. 12 hours ago, I'd been planning a romantic anniversary dinner, and now I was strategizing with a divorce attorney about dismantling my husband's secret life. My phone buzzed with a text from Carolyn. "Lunch today? I have gossip about the Harrison divorce that will curl your hair." I almost laughed at the timing. Caroline Montgomery was my closest friend in the Georgetown social scene, a woman whose talent for gathering information rivaled any intelligence agency. If anyone knew about David's affair, it would be Caroline. Texted back, "Rain check? David filed for divorce this morning." My phone rang immediately. "Victoria Elizabeth Thornfield, what do you mean David filed for divorce? This morning? On your anniversary?" "It's complicated," I said, glancing toward the living room where Patricia was still on her phone. "I'm coming over. Don't you dare say—" "No, I'll bring wine." "Caroline, it's not even noon. Trust me, darling, this calls for wine." She arrived 20 minutes later with a bottle of Chateau Margaux and the determined expression she wore when someone had wronged one of her friends. Caroline was 5 years younger than me, but had been married to her investment banker husband for nearly as long. She understood the delicate ecosystem of Washington society marriages better than anyone. "Patricia Winters," she said, nodding approvingly when I introduced my lawyer. "Excellent choice. She destroyed Hampton Morrison's prenup so thoroughly he had to sell his Georgetown house." "That was a particularly satisfying case," Patricia agreed. "Now, Mrs. Montgomery, Victoria mentioned you might have insights about her husband's recent activities." Caroline settled into my wingback chair with the grace of someone accustomed to being the center of attention. "David's been having an affair for 8 months, possibly longer, with Rebecca Martinez, the redhead from his office. They've been seen at the Jefferson Hotel bar, the Hay Adams restaurant, and, most indiscreetly, at her apartment building in DuPont Circle." My stomach clenched despite having suspected the affair. Hearing it confirmed, with specific locations and timeline, made it devastatingly real. "How do you know all this?" I asked. Caroline's smile was predatory. "Darling, I know everything. Margaret Ashford saw them at the Jefferson in July. Very cozy, very intimate. Sarah Coleman's daughter works at the Hay Adams and recognized David from our charity photos. And my hairdresser lives in Rebecca's building. She's seen David leaving the elevator on Rebecca's floor multiple Saturday mornings. Saturday mornings, I repeated. All those weekend depositions and client emergencies. All those times I'd offered to join him for weekend work trips and been told it would be boring, that he'd rather I stayed home and relaxed. Patricia was taking notes. This timeline coincides with the Meridian Properties documentation. It appears your husband began the affair around the same time he started his business venture with Ms. Martinez. There's more, Caroline continued. Rebecca Martinez isn't just David's associate. Her law firm, Martinez and Associates, specializes in development law, but more specifically, they lobby for zoning changes and municipal development projects. The kind of work that requires extensive relationships with city planners and county commissioners. I felt pieces clicking into place. Inside information. Exactly. David's real estate venture wasn't just about buying undervalued properties. It was about buying properties that were about to become valuable due to zoning changes or infrastructure projects that Rebecca's firm was working on. Patricia looked up from her notes. That could constitute insider trading, depending on how the information was obtained and used. We need to document the connection between Rebecca's lobbying work and David's property purchases. I can help with that, Caroline said. My husband's firm handles municipal bond financing. If Rebecca's firm has been working on development projects that affected David's properties, Charles will know about it. I watched these two women strategizing on my behalf and felt something I hadn't experienced in years, the relief of not being alone. For so long, I'd carried the weight of my failing marriage in isolation, making excuses for David's behavior even to myself. Now, finally, I had allies who saw the situation clearly. There's something else we need to discuss, I said, and told them about my art collection. Patricia's eyebrows rose as I detailed my acquisitions over the past 5 years. When I mentioned the Monet paintings, she set down her pen entirely. Victoria, are you telling me you've spent $8 million on art and antiques over 5 years, all funded by your separate trust account, and your husband has no idea? He never paid attention to my purchases. When I bought the Monet, I told him it was for our living room. He glanced at it once and said it was pretty. The Picasso sketches have been hanging in my study for 3 years. He's never noticed they're originals. Caroline was grinning. You magnificent, sneaky woman. Do you realize what you've done? While David was planning his little real estate scheme, you were building a fortune he can't touch. The question, Patricia said, is whether we want to disclose the full extent of your collection now or wait to see what David claims in his financial statements. I understood her strategy immediately. If David tried to hide assets or undervalue his real estate, holdings we could counter with full disclosure of my collection, making his deception look even worse by contrast. If he was honest about his finances, we could negotiate from a position of strength without revealing all our cards. Let's wait, I decided. See what he files, then respond accordingly. Patricia nodded approvingly. Smart. Now, we need to discuss your priorities. What do you want from this divorce beyond fair financial treatment? The question caught me off guard. For hours, I'd been focused on David's deception and the legal implications. I hadn't considered what I actually wanted my life to look like after the divorce. I want the truth acknowledged, I said finally. I want him to face consequences for his lies, and I want to rebuild my life on my own terms, not as someone who was discarded when she became inconvenient. Perfectly reasonable goals, Patricia said. The truth will emerge during discovery, especially if David tries to hide assets. As for consequences, financial penalties are often more effective than public humiliation in cases like this. My phone buzzed with another text, this one from David. Spoke with Richardson about dividing the wine collection. He can handle the appraisal next week. I showed the message to Patricia and Caroline. Richardson was our sommelier friend who'd helped us acquire several rare bottles over the years. The casual mention of dividing our wine collection felt particularly insulting. David was already treating our marriage like a business liquidation. He's moving fast, Patricia observed. That suggests either confidence or desperation. I'm betting on desperation. Caroline was studying David's message with the intensity she usually reserved for charity auction strategies. Victoria, when did you last check your wine cellar inventory? Months ago. Why? Because men like David don't just hide real estate assets. If he's been planning this divorce for 2 years, he's been planning every aspect of it. The three of us went down to the wine cellar in my basement, a temperature-controlled room that had been one of David's few contributions to our home renovation 15 years ago. The wooden racks held nearly 300 bottles, some worth thousands of dollars each. What we found was worse than I'd expected. The most valuable bottles, the 1982 Bordeaux, the rare Burgundies, the vintage champagnes, were gone. Empty slots in the wooden racks marked where they should have been. The bottles that remained were good but not exceptional, the kind of wines that would appraise for $50 to $200 each rather than thousands. When did you last see the 1982 Lafite? Caroline asked, pointing to an obviously empty space. David opened it for his birthday 2 years ago, I said, then stopped. No, wait. He said he was saving it for a special occasion. I haven't seen it since then. Patricia was photographing the empty spaces with her phone. Your husband has been systematically removing valuable bottles for at least 2 years. This isn't casual wine consumption. It's asset stripping. The scope of David's planning was breathtaking. While I'd been noticing his emotional distance and wondering if our marriage could be repaired, he'd been methodically preparing for its end. The wine cellar was just another piece of evidence that our divorce wasn't a sudden decision. It was the culmination of a carefully executed strategy. We need a complete inventory, Patricia said. Compare what's here now with what you purchased. Originally, the missing bottles represent hidden assets, just like the real estate venture. As we walked back upstairs, Caroline was unusually quiet. Finally, she turned to me with an expression I'd rarely seen from her, genuine concern mixed with anger. Victoria, I need to ask you something, and I want you to think carefully before you answer. Has David ever made you feel like you were losing your mind? Like you were remembering things incorrectly or overreacting to situations? The question was so unexpected that I stopped walking. What do you mean? The wine bottles. The casual mention of feeling like strangers. The way he's framed. This divorce as a mutual decision about growing apart. It sounds like he's been conditioning you to doubt your own perceptions. I thought about all the times I'd questioned my own reactions to David's behavior. The dinners where I'd felt ignored, only to have David later claim I was being overly sensitive. The social events where I'd noticed his attention to other women, only to be told I was being paranoid. The financial decisions he'd made without consultation, then explained away as protecting me from boring details. Maybe, I said slowly. I've definitely learned not to trust my first instincts about David's behavior. That's exactly what I was afraid of, Caroline said. He's been gaslighting you, slowly and systematically, making you doubt your own judgment so you wouldn't question his actions. Patricia nodded grimly. It's a common pattern in cases where one spouse has been planning a secret exit. They create an environment where their partner becomes passive and self-doubting, making the eventual divorce seem inevitable rather than orchestrated. Back in my living room, I felt exhausted by the revelations of the past few hours. My marriage hadn't just ended. It had been murdered slowly, methodically, over the course of years. David hadn't fallen out of love with me. He'd systematically undermined our relationship while building an alternative life with Rebecca Martinez. What happens next? I asked Patricia. First, we respond to his divorce filing with our own petition, including everything we've discovered today. Second, we request full financial discovery. Every bank account, investment, property record, and business dealing from the past 5 years. Third, We prepare for him to escalate. Escalate how? Men like David don't expect their wives to fight back effectively. When they discover you're not going to quietly accept his version of events, they usually get nasty. He'll try to paint you as unstable, vindictive, or financially irresponsible. He might attempt to freeze assets or pressure you through social channels. Caroline's expression turned fierce. Let him try. Half the women in Georgetown have been in similar situations. David's about to discover that discarded wives have a very strong support network in this city. After Patricia left with copies of all the Meridian Properties documents, Caroline stayed for another hour, and we opened a bottle of wine, one of the remaining good bottles David hadn't stolen. As the afternoon light faded through my living room windows, she asked the question I'd been avoiding. Are you okay, Victoria? Really okay? I considered the question seriously. That morning, I'd been a wife trying to save her marriage. Now I was a woman preparing for war against a husband who'd been deceiving me for years. I should have felt devastated, heartbroken, lost. Instead, I felt oddly energized. I think I'm better than okay, I said. For the first time in years, I understand what's really been happening in my marriage. The confusion is gone. The self-doubt is gone. I know exactly who David is and exactly what he's done. And he has no idea who I really am or what I'm capable of. He thinks he's divorcing a passive society wife who will accept whatever settlement he offers. Instead, he's about to face someone who's been quietly building her own power base for 5 years. Caroline raised her glass. To David's education. To David's education, I agreed. As she left, Caroline paused at my front door. Victoria, promise me something. Don't let David back into this house. Don't meet with him alone. Don't trust anything he says from now on. The man you were married to for 25 years is gone, if he ever existed at all. What's left is a stranger who's been using you. After she left, I walked through my empty house, seeing it differently than I had that morning. This wasn't the home David and I had built together. It was the home I'd created while he'd been planning his escape. Every room reflected my taste, my choices, my vision for our life together. He'd been a passenger in the marriage I'd been driving alone. I went to my study and opened my laptop, pulling up the insurance records for my art collection. Looking at the current appraisals, I realized Caroline had been right to call me magnificent and sneaky. Without even trying, I'd built a financial empire that David couldn't touch. The Monet water lily paintings were now worth $12 million. The Picasso sketches had tripled in value. The vintage jewelry I'd worn to charity events was worth more than David's annual salary. In total, my collection was now appraised at over $28 million. David thought he was walking away from our marriage with his secret real estate fortune and his freedom to marry Rebecca Martinez. What he didn't realize was that his soon-to-be ex-wife was wealthier than he'd ever dreamed of being, and she was just getting started. The next morning brought unexpected visitors. I was having coffee in my sunroom, reviewing Patricia's preliminary filing documents when my housekeeper Elena appeared with a concerned expression. Mrs. Thornfield, there are 2 men at the front door. They say they're appraisers, sent by Mr. Thornfield to evaluate household items. I set down my coffee cup with deliberate care. David was moving even faster than Patricia had predicted. Did they show identification? Yes, ma'am. From Hartwell Appraisal Services. They have some papers. Through my front window, I could see a white van parked in my driveway with estate valuations emblazoned on the side. 2 men in business casual clothing stood on my porch, clipboards in hand, looking like they owned the place. I called Patricia immediately. David sent appraisers to my house. Can he do that? Absolutely not. Patricia's voice was sharp with anger. We haven't even filed our response yet. This is intimidation, pure and simple. Don't let them in. I'm calling Judge Morrison's clerk right now to request an emergency hearing. I walked to my front door and opened it just wide enough to speak to the 2 men. Gentlemen, I'm going to need you to leave. Any appraisals will be scheduled through proper legal channels. The older man, wearing a navy blazer that had seen better days, stepped closer. Ma'am, we have authorization from David Thornfield to conduct a household inventory. This is standard procedure in divorce proceedings. Standard procedure is notification through attorneys and court approval, I replied. You have neither. Please leave my property. Look, lady, we're just trying to do our job. Your husband hired us to— My husband has no legal right to send strangers into my home without my consent or court order. If you don't leave immediately, I'll call the police. The younger appraiser was already backing toward their van, clearly uncomfortable with the confrontation. His partner held his ground for another moment before grudgingly following. As they drove away, I felt a surge of satisfaction. David had expected the passive wife he'd been conditioning for years. Instead, he'd encountered someone who knew her rights and wasn't afraid to enforce them. My phone rang within minutes. David's voice was tight with controlled anger. Victoria, what the hell are you doing? Those appraisers were just trying to inventory household items. It's standard procedure. Standard procedure is obtaining court approval first, I said calmly. Something your lawyers should have explained. Don't be difficult about this. We both want this divorce to proceed smoothly. The word we was particularly galling. There is no we anymore, David. You made that clear yesterday. From now on, all communication goes through our attorneys. Victoria, you're being unreasonable. I'm trying to make this easy on both of us. Easy would have been being honest about your affair, your business dealings, and your plans to divorce me. Easy would have been not stealing wine from our cellar or using marital assets for secret investments. But we're past easy now. The silence on the line stretched for several seconds. When David spoke again, his lawyer voice had replaced his attempted warmth. I see you've been busy. How much did you pay Patricia Winters to poison you against me? Patricia didn't poison me against you, David. You did that all by yourself over the past 2 years. After hanging up, I realized David's call had revealed something important. He was rattled. The confident man who'd handed me divorce papers yesterday was now making tactical errors, sending unauthorized appraisers and calling to argue directly instead of working through his attorney. Elena appeared, with the morning mail, including a thick envelope from Morrison, Klein & Associates, David's firm. Inside was a formal letter from David's divorce attorney, James Richardson, requesting a meeting to discuss settlement terms amicably before unnecessary legal expenses accrue. I photographed the letter and sent it to Patricia with a text. They want to settle already. Getting nervous? Her response came immediately. Very nervous. Emergency hearing is set for tomorrow morning. Judge Morrison wants to know why David thought he could send appraisers without court approval. The rest of the morning brought a parade of phone calls. First, Margaret called from San Francisco, having heard about the divorce through the mysterious network that connected East and West Coast society wives. Victoria, honey, I just heard. Are you okay? Do you need me to fly out there? Margaret was 3 years older and had been through her own high-profile divorce 5 years earlier. Her ex-husband, a prominent venture capitalist, had tried similar tactics before discovering that Margaret had quietly transferred millions into art investments during their marriage. I'm actually doing better than I expected, I said. Turns out David taught me more about strategic thinking than he realized. Good. Don't let him gaslight you into accepting less than you deserve. These men count on us being too polite to fight back properly. Next came a call from my mother in Charleston, who'd heard the news from Caroline's mother. At 78, Elizabeth Whitmore had survived her own society marriage to my father, a prominent judge who'd died 10 years earlier. Darling, I won't pretend to be surprised, she said in her refined Southern drawl. I never trusted David completely. Too smooth, too calculating. Men like that always have an exit strategy. You never said anything. What was I supposed to say? You seemed happy, or at least content. But I noticed how he managed you, steered conversations, made decisions. Your father did the same thing, God rest his soul. These powerful men think they're conducting orchestras with wives as their first violins. Her words stung because they were accurate. I had been David's first violin, playing the melodies he chose while he conducted the symphony of our social life. By afternoon, Caroline arrived with reinforcements. 3 women I knew from various charity boards, all of whom had survived high-profile divorces in the past decade. Emergency wine and war counsel, Caroline announced, setting down bottles and takeout bags. Ladies, you know Victoria. Victoria, meet your new advisory board. Susan Hartwell had divorced a prominent lobbyist after discovering his cocaine habit and gambling debts. Jennifer Blake's ex-husband had been a Georgetown professor who'd been embezzling from his department. Amanda Cross had ended her marriage to a State Department official who'd been selling information to foreign contacts. The first thing you need to understand, Susan said, opening a bottle of Sancerre, is that men like David have playbooks. They all use the same tactics because they all learn from the same divorce attorneys. Let me guess, Jennifer added. He's trying to rush the process, claiming he wants to keep things amicable. He's probably suggested you don't really need your own lawyer. Amanda nodded. And he's positioning himself as the reasonable one while painting you as emotional or vindictive for not accepting his generous offer. Their accuracy was unsettling. David had used every one of those tactics in the past 24 hours. Good news, Caroline said, is that we've all been through this. We know how the game is played, and more importantly, we know how to win. Susan pulled out a notebook. First, document everything, every conversation, every email, every attempt at manipulation. Judges see patterns, and David's already establishing a pattern of overreach. Second, Jennifer continued, don't let him isolate you. He'll try to turn mutual friends against you, suggest you're not handling the divorce well, maybe hint at mental health issues. Third, Amanda concluded, trust your attorney completely but verify everything David claims. Men like him lie reflexively, especially about finances. As the afternoon wore on, these women shared stories that were both horrifying and oddly comforting. Each had faced similar betrayals, similar manipulations, and similar attempts to minimize their worth. Each had also emerged stronger, wealthier, and infinitely wiser. The beautiful irony, Susan said, is that these men are so arrogant they usually defeat themselves. They can't believe their wives are smart enough to outmaneuver them. David's already making mistakes, Caroline observed. Sending unauthorized appraisers, calling you directly, trying to rush settlement discussions. He's acting like a man who's afraid of something. What could he be afraid of? I asked. Discovery, Jennifer said immediately. Full financial disclosure. If David's been hiding assets or using insider information for his real estate ventures, the last thing he wants is a thorough investigation of his business dealings. That evening, I sat in my study looking through old photo albums, trying to pinpoint when David had stopped being my husband and started being my manipulator. The pictures told a story I hadn't recognized while living it. In early photos, David looked at me with genuine affection, his arm around me naturally, his smile reaching his eyes. Gradually, over the years, his expressions became more controlled, his postures more calculated. By our 20th anniversary photos, he looked like an actor playing the role of devoted husband. I was studying a photo from last year's Kennedy Center Gala when I noticed something that made me freeze. In the background, barely visible but unmistakable, was Rebecca Martinez. She was seated at a table across the ballroom, but her eyes were fixed on David with an expression of unmistakable intimacy. The gala had been in March, 11 months ago. David's affair hadn't begun 8 months ago, as Caroline had reported. It had been going on for nearly a year, possibly longer. I called Patricia's emergency line. I found something. David's affair started earlier than we thought. How much? Earlier? At least 11 months ago, maybe more. I have photographic evidence. Send it to me immediately. If David lied about the timeline of his affair, he might be lying about other things too. As I scanned the photo and sent it to Patricia, my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Stop making this harder than it has to be. Take the settlement and move on. Some secrets are better left buried. I stared at the message, my hands trembling slightly. The tone was menacing, but the sophistication suggested it hadn't come from David directly. Someone else was involved, someone who thought I could be intimidated. I forwarded the text to Patricia and called Caroline. Someone just threatened me. What kind of threat? I read her the message. Her response was immediate and fierce. They're scared, Victoria? Really scared? This isn't about a simple divorce anymore. This is about something bigger they're trying to hide. What could be bigger than adultery and hidden assets? I don't know yet, but Charles might. Let me make some calls. An hour later, Caroline called back with information that changed everything. Victoria, sit down. Charles checked with his contacts at the municipal bond office. Rebecca Martinez's law firm has been involved in 3 major development projects over the past 2 years, projects that required rezoning approvals from city planning boards. And David's Meridian Properties purchased land adjacent to all 3 projects 6 months before the rezoning applications were filed. They bought low and sold high once the developments were announced. The implications hit me like a physical blow. That's not just insider trading, that's corruption. It gets worse. One of those developments was the Metro Extension project. The land purchases would have required advance knowledge of route plans that weren't made public for another year. How much money are we talking about? Based on public records of the land sales, at least $15 million in profits. Maybe more. I understood now why David wanted a quick, quiet divorce. He wasn't just hiding marital assets. He was hiding evidence of criminal activity. Rebecca Martinez wasn't just his affair partner. She was his co-conspirator in a scheme that involved municipal corruption and insider trading. The threatening text message wasn't from David. It was from someone who knew that a thorough investigation of David's finances would expose crimes that went far beyond marital infidelity. Caroline, I need to ask you something important. Are you prepared for this to get very ugly? If we pursue this fully, it won't just be a divorce. It'll be a criminal investigation. Victoria, honey, they threatened you. That was their first mistake. Their second mistake was underestimating how much Georgetown society wives hate being threatened. What do you mean? I mean, you're about to discover that the network of women who've survived high-profile divorces in this city is more powerful than you ever imagined. And we don't like bullies. After hanging up, I walked through my house one more time, seeing it not as the home I was about to lose, but as the fortress from which I would fight. David had spent 2 years planning what he thought would be my quiet exit from his life. Instead, he'd given me the motivation and evidence to expose not just his affair, but what appeared to be a criminal enterprise involving municipal corruption and insider trading. The passive wife he'd been conditioning for years was gone, replaced by someone who understood that the best defense was often a devastating offense. I opened my laptop and began drafting an email to Patricia. It was time to stop playing defense and start playing to win. Tomorrow's emergency hearing was just the beginning. David had started a war he wasn't prepared to fight, against an opponent he'd never bothered to truly understand. His education was about to become very expensive. The D.C. Superior Court building loomed gray and imposing against the October sky as Patricia and I walked up the stone steps at 8:30 the next morning. I had chosen my outfit carefully, a charcoal gray Armani suit that projected authority without appearing combative, paired with my grandmother's pearl necklace for strength. "Remember," Patricia said quietly as we approached the security checkpoint, Judge Morrison doesn't tolerate games. He's seen every manipulation tactic in the book, and he particularly dislikes lawyers who think they can intimidate opposing parties outside of court. Inside the courthouse, the familiar sounds of legal proceedings filled the marble corridors, hushed conversations between attorneys, the clicking of heels on polished floors, and the occasional raised voice from behind courtroom doors. I had attended enough legal functions with David to feel comfortable in this environment, but today, I was here as a participant, not a spectator. David was already seated at the opposing counsel table when we entered Judge Morrison's courtroom. He looked immaculate as always, his dark suit perfectly pressed, his expression carefully neutral. Beside him sat James Richardson, his divorce attorney, a man I'd met at numerous Morrison firm parties, who had always been charming and deferential to me as David's wife. Today, Richardson avoided my eyes entirely. What surprised me was the third person at their table, a woman I didn't recognize, wearing an expensive black suit and taking notes with the intensity of someone who found the proceedings personally significant. She was too old to be Rebecca Martinez, too professionally dressed to be a court reporter. "Who's the woman with David?" I whispered to Patricia. Patricia glanced over and frowned. "I don't know, but she's not on the witness list. I'll find out." Judge Morrison entered precisely at 9 o'clock, a man in his 60s whose reputation for fairness was matched only by his intolerance for legal theatrics. His silver hair and wire-rimmed glasses gave him a scholarly appearance, but his expression could freeze lawyers mid-sentence when they overstepped boundaries. "We're here for an emergency hearing in the matter of Thornfield versus Thornfield," Judge Morrison announced, settling behind his bench. "Mr. Richardson, I understand you have some explaining to do regarding unauthorized property appraisals." Richardson stood, clearing his throat. "Your Honor, my client was merely attempting to facilitate an efficient division of marital assets. The appraisers were professional and legitimate." "Mr. Richardson," Judge Morrison interrupted, "are you familiar with the concept of court approval for such activities?" "Of course, Your Honor, but then perhaps you can explain why your client felt entitled to bypass that requirement and send strangers into Mrs. Thornfield's residence without her consent or court authorization." I watched David's jaw tighten as his attorney struggled to justify their actions. The woman beside him continued taking notes, her pen moving rapidly across her legal pad. Patricia rose smoothly. "Your Honor, this unauthorized intrusion was part of a pattern of intimidation tactics my client has endured since Mr. Thornfield filed for divorce just 2 days ago. We have documentation of additional concerning behavior, such as anonymous threatening text messages sent to Mrs. Thornfield, attempts to pressure her into hasty settlement negotiations, and what appears to be systematic removal of valuable assets from the marital home over the past 2 years. Judge Morrison's expression grew stern. "Mr. Richardson, I hope you're prepared to address these allegations." "Your Honor, my client categorically denies sending any threatening messages. As for asset management, Mr. Thornfield has been transparent about all his business activities and investments." Patricia smiled slightly, never a good sign for opposing counsel. "Your Honor, we'd like to present evidence that contradicts that claim." She approached the bench with a folder containing the Meridian Properties documents, the wine cellar photographs, and the timeline Caroline had helped us construct linking David's affair to his business ventures. Judge Morrison reviewed the documents, in silence, his expression growing more serious with each page. Finally, he looked up at Richardson. "Mr. Richardson, are you aware that your client has been operating a business partnership worth over $2 million without disclosure in his initial divorce filing?" "Your Honor, Meridian Properties is a legitimate business venture." "That's not what I asked. Are you aware that he failed to disclose it?" Richardson glanced at David, who nodded almost imperceptibly. "We were prepared to amend the filing to include all relevant business interests." "How convenient," Judge Morrison said, dryly. And are you prepared to explain how a business partnership formed with insider knowledge of municipal development plans constitutes a legitimate venture? The silence in the courtroom was absolute. David's face had gone pale, and Richardson looked genuinely shocked. Apparently, David hadn't told his divorce attorney about the criminal aspects of his real estate scheme. The unknown woman at their table leaned forward and whispered urgently in David's ear. He shook his head firmly, but her expression suggested the conversation wasn't over. "Your Honor," Patricia said, "we have reason to believe Mr. Thornfield's business activities may involve criminal conduct that extends beyond marital asset concealment. We request full discovery of all his business records, communications, and financial transactions over the past 3 years." "Your Honor, that's an extraordinary request," Richardson protested. "My client's business dealings are not relevant to divorce proceedings unless they involve marital assets." "They do involve marital assets," Patricia countered. "Mr. Thornfield used home equity loans and joint account funds to finance his initial investments. Moreover, the profits from allegedly criminal activities are marital property subject to division." Judge Morrison set down the documents and fixed David with a stare that would have withered most men. "Mr. Thornfield, do you have anything to say about these allegations?" David stood, his composure intact despite the circumstances. "Your Honor, I have conducted all my business activities in full compliance with applicable laws. The Meridian Properties Partnership is legitimate, profitable, and properly documented. My wife's attorneys are attempting to criminalize ordinary business practices. Ordinary business practices don't typically involve advanced knowledge of municipal zoning changes," Judge Morrison observed. "Nor do they usually result in anonymous threats against opposing parties in divorce proceedings." "I had nothing to do with any threatening messages," David said firmly. The unknown woman tugged at David's sleeve, clearly wanting him to stop talking. "I was increasingly curious about her identity and role in this proceeding." Judge Morrison turned to Patricia. "Mrs. Winters, what specific relief are you requesting?" "First, a protective order preventing any further contact between Mr. Thornfield and my client outside of court-approved communications. Second, an immediate asset freeze on all Meridian Properties accounts pending full disclosure. Third, authorization for forensic accounting of all Mr. Thornfield's business activities over the past 3 years. And fourth, appointment of a special master to oversee asset preservation during discovery." Richardson jumped to his feet. "Your Honor, these requests are punitive and excessive. My client has cooperated fully with all legitimate discovery requests. Mr. Richardson, sending unauthorized appraisers to your opposing party's home is not cooperation. It's intimidation. And failing to disclose a $2 million business venture is not full cooperation. It's concealment." Judge Morrison reviewed his notes before continuing. "Here's what we're going to do. First, Mr. Thornfield is prohibited from any direct or indirect contact with Mrs. Thornfield except through counsel. Second, all assets related to Meridian Properties are frozen pending full disclosure and accounting. Third, both parties will provide complete financial statements, including all business interests, within 30 days. He paused, looking directly at David. "Mr. Thornfield, if I discover you've been less than forthcoming about any aspect of your financial situation, this court will take a very dim view of your credibility in all matters going forward." "Understood, Your Honor," David replied, though his voice had lost its earlier confidence. "Furthermore," Judge Morrison continued, "I'm referring this matter to the U.S. Attorney's Office for review of potential criminal violations related to municipal corruption and insider trading. This court cannot ignore evidence of possible federal crimes." The woman beside David went rigid, her pen frozen mid-sentence. Richardson looked like he'd been struck by lightning. Only Patricia remained calm, having anticipated this development. "Your Honor," Richardson said desperately, "surely that's premature. These are unsubstantiated allegations. Mr. Richardson, your client used advanced knowledge of government planning decisions to profit from real estate transactions. Whether that constitutes criminal conduct is not for this court to determine, but it certainly warrants investigation by appropriate authorities. As court adjourned, I felt a strange mixture of relief and apprehension. We had won this battle decisively, but the war was far from over. David's financial empire was now under scrutiny, his assets frozen, and his activities subject to criminal investigation. Outside the courtroom, the mystery woman finally introduced herself. "Mrs. Thornfield, I'm Sandra Walsh from the mayor's office," she said, extending her hand. "I was here as an observer, given the allegations about municipal corruption." "Observer?" I repeated. "The mayor's office takes allegations of corruption very seriously, particularly when they involve city planning and zoning decisions. If criminal charges are filed, several current development projects could be affected." The implications were staggering. David's scheme hadn't just involved stealing from our marriage. It had potentially corrupted legitimate municipal development projects worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Patricia pulled me aside as we walked toward the courthouse exit. "Victoria, you need to understand what just happened in there. This isn't just a divorce anymore. David is facing potential federal criminal charges. That changes everything about how we proceed." "How so?" "He's going to get desperate. Really desperate. Men facing prison time don't make rational decisions. You need to be extremely careful about your personal security." As if summoned by her words, my phone buzzed with a text from the same unknown number as before. "You have no idea what you've just set in motion. Last warning." I showed the message to Patricia, who immediately flagged down a court security officer. Within minutes, I was surrounded by people taking my safety very seriously. "Mrs. Thornfield," the security officer said, "we're going to escort you to your car and recommend you contact local police about these threats. This is no longer a civil matter." As we walked through the courthouse parking garage, I spotted David near his Mercedes, engaged in an animated conversation with Sandra Walsh and two men in dark suits I didn't recognize. His gestures were sharp and agitated, a far cry from his controlled courtroom demeanor. "Who are those men with David?" I asked Patricia. She glanced over and frowned. "I don't know, but they look like federal agents." We reached my car without incident, but as I drove home, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. A black sedan maintained the same distance behind me for several blocks before disappearing into traffic. At home, Elena met me at the door with a concerned expression. "Mrs. Thornfield, there have been several phone calls asking for you. They wouldn't leave names, but they sounded official." My home phone was ringing as she spoke. I answered to find a crisp, professional voice on the other end. "Mrs. Thornfield, this is Agent Jennifer Collins with the FBI's Public Corruption Unit. We'd like to schedule a meeting to discuss your husband's business activities. Are you available this afternoon?" The FBI. David's municipal corruption scheme had attracted federal attention faster than anyone had expected. "Agent Collins, I think I need to have my attorney present for any such meeting." "Of course. We can meet at your attorney's office if that's more convenient." "This is a voluntary interview, Mrs. Thornfield. We believe you may have information relevant to our investigation." After scheduling the meeting for later that afternoon, I called Caroline with an update. Her reaction was immediate and concerned. "Victoria, you need to get out of that house. If David is facing federal charges, there's no telling what he might do. Come stay with us until this settles down. I'm not running from my own home. I'm not asking you to run. I'm asking you to be smart. Charles knows federal prosecutors. They don't move this fast unless they already have substantial evidence. David could be arrested within days." The thought of David in handcuffs should have satisfied me, but instead I felt oddly empty. 25 years of marriage, and it was ending not with heartbreak, but with criminal investigations and FBI interviews. My phone rang again. This time it was Margaret calling from San Francisco. "Victoria, I just heard what happened in court today. Are you safe?" "How did you hear?" "Darling, this is Washington, D.C. News travels faster than light. especially when it involves prominent lawyers and federal corruption charges. You're about to become the most famous divorce in the city." She was right. By evening, my phone was ringing constantly with calls from reporters, social acquaintances, and people I barely knew. The story of David Thornfield's corruption scandal was spreading through DC's legal and social circles like wildfire. Caroline arrived with an overnight bag and a bottle of wine. "I'm staying here tonight and don't argue. Charles is in contact with federal prosecutors about David's case. This is bigger than we thought." "How much bigger?" The Meridian Properties scheme apparently involved kickbacks to city planning officials and falsified environmental impact studies. "We're talking about RICO charges, conspiracy, and potentially dozens of co-conspirators." I sat in my living room, surrounded by the elegant furnishings and artwork that had defined my life as David Thornfield's wife, and realized that everything was about to change. Win or lose, there was no going back to the woman I had been just 3 days ago. David had intended to discard me quietly, leaving me with a generous settlement and his version of our story. Instead, his greed and deception had exposed him to criminal prosecution and destroyed his carefully constructed reputation. But as I watched the evening news report about a prominent Georgetown lawyer under federal investigation for corruption, I wondered if my victory would prove Pyrrhic. David was going down, but he might take half of Washington's development establishment with him, and somewhere in that wreckage would be the remains of the life I thought I'd built with the man I thought I'd married. 3 months after that morning, when David had handed me divorce papers on our 25th anniversary, I stood in my study watching FBI agents load boxes of evidence into their van. The investigation had moved faster than anyone anticipated, unraveling a corruption scheme that reached into the highest levels of DC's municipal government. Agent Jennifer Collins knocked on my doorframe. "Mrs. Thornfield, we're finished with the house search. Thank you for your cooperation throughout this investigation." "Any word on when the arrests will be made?" I asked, though I already suspected the answer. "Tomorrow morning. Your husband and 12 co-conspirators, including Rebecca Martinez and 3 city planning commissioners. The grand jury returned indictments yesterday afternoon. The irony wasn't lost on me. David, who had orchestrated my humiliation with such careful timing, would be arrested exactly 3 months after serving me with divorce papers. The universe had a twisted sense of poetic justice. After the agents left, I walked through my house. Truly my house now, since David's assets remained frozen pending criminal trial. The place felt different, lighter somehow, as if removing David's deception had lifted an oppressive weight from the rooms themselves. My phone buzzed with a text from Caroline. "Champagne is chilled. Victory party at my house tonight. The whole Georgetown Survivors Club is coming." The Georgetown Survivors Club. That's what we'd started calling ourselves. The group of women who had gathered to support me had evolved into something larger, a network of wives who had discovered their own strength through surviving their husbands' betrayals. Susan, Jennifer, Amanda, and 6 other women had become not just my advisors, but my closest friends. Patricia arrived at 5 o'clock with the final divorce papers and a satisfied smile. "It's done, Victoria. David signed everything this morning, just hours before the FBI raid on his office. He gets to keep whatever assets remain unfrozen after criminal forfeiture, which amounts to roughly $50,000, and his law school debt. And the house? Yours free and clear, along with your art collection, which the FBI confirmed is worth $32 million at current market value. David waived all claims to marital property in exchange for your testimony against his co-conspirators. I signed the papers that officially ended my marriage to David Thornfield. 25 years reduced to a signature on legal documents. It should have felt momentous, but mostly I felt relieved. There's one more thing," Patricia said, pulling out another document. "The U.S. Attorney's Office is offering you a role as a cooperating witness. Your testimony about David's financial deceptions would be crucial in securing convictions." What would that involve? Testifying about what you observed during your marriage, particularly David's secretive behavior around the Meridian Properties investments. Your credibility as a victim of his deceptions would be powerful in court. The idea of testifying against David should have troubled me more than it did. But the man who had systematically deceived me for years, who had planned to discard me while stealing marital assets, deserved to face the consequences of his choices. I'll do it, I said. That evening, Caroline's house was filled with laughter and celebration. The Georgetown Survivors Club had grown to 12 women, all of whom had emerged stronger from their divorces. We raised our glasses to more than just my legal victory. We celebrated the discovery that we were capable of fighting back against men who had underestimated us. To Victoria, Susan declared, who showed us all that sometimes the best revenge is simply telling the truth. To David's education, Amanda added, echoing the toast Caroline and I had shared months earlier. As the evening wound down, Caroline pulled me aside. Have you thought about what comes next? You're free, wealthy, and about to become famous for bringing down one of the biggest corruption schemes in D.C. history. I hadn't thought much beyond surviving the divorce and criminal investigation. The idea of building a new life seemed both thrilling and terrifying. I've been thinking about starting a foundation, I said slowly. Something to help women navigate high-asset divorces, particularly when they suspect financial deception. So many women stay in bad marriages because they think they can't afford to leave. Caroline's eyes lit up. The Victoria Thornfield Foundation for Women's Financial Independence. I love it. 6 months later, I sat in the federal courthouse watching David Thornfield and his co-conspirators receive their sentences. David got 7 years in federal prison for conspiracy, money laundering, and corruption. Rebecca Martinez received 5 years. The scheme had defrauded taxpayers of over $40 million and corrupted legitimate development projects throughout the D.C. area. When it was my turn to give a victim impact statement, I stood before the packed courtroom and spoke clearly about the personal cost of David's deceptions. Your Honor, David Thornfield didn't just steal money or corrupt municipal processes. He stole 25 years of my life by making me complicit in a marriage built on lies. He systematically undermined my self-confidence and judgment so I wouldn't question his activities. The financial crimes were devastating to our community, but the personal betrayal was devastating to me as an individual. I paused, looking directly at David for the first time since our divorce was finalized. He met my gaze briefly before looking away. However, I want to thank the court for ensuring that the truth came to light. David's actions inadvertently gave me something precious, the knowledge that I'm stronger than I ever imagined. His attempt to discard me quietly led to discoveries that will help other women avoid similar betrayals. Judge Morrison nodded approvingly before addressing David directly. Mr. Thornfield, your crimes were calculated, sustained, and showed a callous disregard for both the public trust and your personal relationships. The sentence reflects the seriousness of your actions and their impact on victims like your ex-wife. As David was led away in handcuffs, I felt no triumph, only closure. The man I'd married no longer existed, if he ever had. What remained was a criminal who had used everyone around him in service of his greed and ego. Outside the courthouse, reporters gathered for my statement about the foundation I was launching with the divorce settlement money David had been forced to pay me. Ironically, funded by the very corruption scheme he'd tried to hide. The Victoria Thornfield Foundation will provide legal and financial resources to women who suspect their spouses are hiding assets or engaging in financial deception, I announced. No woman should have to choose between financial security and personal dignity. We'll make sure they have the tools to fight back. Caroline stood beside me, along with Patricia and the other members of our Georgetown Survivors Club. These women had become my true family, bound not by blood or marriage, but by shared experience and mutual support. A year later, I hosted the Foundation's first annual gala in the ballroom of the Kennedy Center. 500 guests raised over $2 million to support women facing high-asset divorces complicated by financial deception. The evening was a triumph of everything I'd learned about organizing, networking, and using my resources for meaningful purposes. Margaret had flown in from San Francisco for the event, along with my mother from Charleston. As the evening wound down, Margaret raised her champagne glass for a final toast. To Victoria, who turned the worst day of her marriage into the first day of her real life. Standing on the Kennedy Center terrace overlooking the Potomac River, I reflected on the journey from that October morning when David had handed me divorce papers along with his anniversary greeting. He had intended to give me my freedom as a dismissal, a way of discarding me without guilt or complications. Instead, he had given me something far more valuable: the motivation to discover who I really was when I wasn't trying to be the wife someone else wanted me to be. The Foundation had already helped 37 women navigate complex divorces, recovering over $12 million in hidden assets. My art collection had grown to 48 pieces worth over $50 million. I served on 6 charity boards and had been featured on the cover of Washingtonian magazine as one of the city's most influential women. But more importantly, I had learned that I was capable of standing up for myself and others. The passive wife who had accepted David's version of reality for 25 years was gone, replaced by someone who trusted her own judgment and refused to be anyone's victim. My phone buzzed with a text from Caroline. David made parole review. Today. Denied for another 2 years. Thought you should know. I read the message and felt nothing. No satisfaction, no anger, no lingering pain. David Thornfield had become irrelevant to my life, a footnote in someone else's story. The woman he had tried to discard had grown into someone he could never have imagined or controlled. 6 months later, I received a letter forwarded through Patricia's office. David's handwriting was unmistakable, even after all this time. Victoria, it began, I know I have no right to contact you, and I don't expect forgiveness. I wanted you to know that I've had time to think about what I did to you, to us, and to all the people affected by my choices. You were right about everything. I was a coward who tried to blame you for my own failures as a husband and a man. You deserved better than what I gave you, and I'm glad you found the strength to fight for what you deserved. I hope you're happy. David. I read the letter twice, then filed it away without responding. David's remorse might be genuine, but it was irrelevant to the life I'd built since leaving him behind. Forgiveness was something I might choose to give him someday, but it would be for my benefit, not his. That evening, I had dinner with Caroline and Charles, along with their daughter Emma, who was home from college. Emma was studying business, law, inspired partly by watching me navigate my divorce and foundation work. Mrs. Thornfield, Emma said over dessert, I wanted to thank you for showing me that women can fight back when powerful men try to dismiss them. Your story changed how I think about standing up for myself. Looking at this intelligent young woman who saw me as a role model rather than a cautionary tale, I realized David had given me one final gift without meaning to. By trying to reduce me to nothing, he had forced me to discover everything I was capable of becoming. But perhaps the most satisfying development was unexpected. Rebecca Martinez, released from federal prison after serving 3 years, contacted me through Patricia's office. She wanted to meet. We met at a small cafe in Arlington, neutral territory where neither of us had history. Rebecca looked older, humbler, marked by her time in prison and the collapse of her legal career. I don't expect forgiveness, she said immediately. I wanted to apologize for my part in destroying your marriage and for the criminal activities that hurt so many people. Why? I asked. Why David? Why the corruption scheme? Why any of it? Rebecca stared at her coffee cup for a long moment. Honestly, because I thought I deserved what you had. The successful husband, the beautiful house, the social position. I thought if I could take it from you, I could become you. It was childish and destructive and wrong. You never could have become me, I said quietly, because the version of me you wanted to be was an illusion. I was playing a role in David's life, not living my own life. You would have been just as trapped as I was. She nodded slowly. I understand that now. Prison gave me time to think about who I really am when I'm not trying to be someone else or take what someone else has. I left our meeting feeling oddly grateful. Rebecca's apology hadn't been necessary for my healing, but it confirmed something important. The life David and I had built together really had been an illusion, attractive to outsiders, but hollow at its core. 2 years after our divorce was finalized, I remarried. Not to another prominent lawyer or society figure, but to Michael Chen, a widowed art history professor at Georgetown University, whom I met while donating pieces to the university museum. Michael was quietly brilliant, genuinely kind, and completely uninterested in social status or financial advantage. Our wedding was small and private, held in the garden of my Georgetown house with only close friends and family present. Caroline served as my matron of honor, and Margaret flew in from San Francisco to walk me down the aisle since my father had passed away. Standing in my garden, exchanging vows with a man who saw me as I really was, I thought about the morning. David had handed me divorce papers along with his anniversary greeting. He had meant to end our story with my dismissal, positioning himself as the one moving forward while I remained behind to manage the wreckage. Instead, that morning had been the beginning of everything real in my life. The foundation, the friendships, the self-knowledge, and now this second chance at love with someone who valued my mind and heart rather than my social connections or financial assets. Happy anniversary, Michael whispered as we were pronounced husband and wife, acknowledging that this was indeed an anniversary, not of divorce papers and betrayal, but of the day I had learned to value myself enough to fight for the life I deserved. The sun was setting over Georgetown as our small group of guests celebrated with champagne and laughter. Caroline raised a toast that perfectly captured the journey from that devastating October morning to this perfect October evening. To Victoria, who discovered that sometimes the worst thing that can happen to you is actually the best thing that can happen to you if you're brave enough to see it that way. As Michael and I danced to our first song as husband and wife, I caught sight of the white roses blooming in my garden, the same variety David had given me on our first anniversary, the same flowers I had been arranging when he handed me divorce papers. But these roses I had planted myself, in soil I had prepared, in a garden that belonged entirely to me. David had tried to give me my freedom as a way of getting rid of me. Instead, he had given me the opportunity to give myself something far more valuable, the chance to discover who I really was and what I was truly capable of achieving. His anniversary gift, intended as an ending, had become the beginning of everything. That mattered. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.